With the invention of bronze and settling down for a bit, humanity had now formed something brand new: civilization. Great empires rose across the world: the Sumerians, the Egyptians, fueled by none other than beer. Some of them had switched from beer to alternatives like wine, but these drinks were easier to make in their respective climates. Beer itself had not changed much over time, although it was clear that boozy drinks were going to be part of a human experience. But before we move on to the next part of beer's history, we have to talk about a shift in civilization: the Bronze Age collapse, and what came after. The Bronze Age collapse is about as dramatic as it sounds. Round about 12,000 BCE, a lot of long-standing empires all fell apart, with only a few of them managing to survive, albeit lesser than they were before. Now, it must be said that this only really happened to the empires in Europe and the Middle East. Other regions were still doing their own thing. China, for example. Now, these folks were not making beer, as I mentioned in Chapter 2, so let's stay on track. The collapse of some of these great empires is a bit of a mystery, because we're not entirely sure what caused it. It could have been war, drought, volcanoes, or a general change in culture and warfare that came about with the invention of a new metal: iron. Whatever the cause, the collapse was intense and fast. In about 50 years, the world stage had changed dramatically. But there was still beer, and the Egyptians were still around, and they were still making it as they had been for centuries, as did their Mesopotamian contemporaries, the Assyrians. Since it was mostly a domestic affair, beer production continued just as it had before. One of the casualties of this great collapse was the Mycenaean Empire over in Cyprus. These folks had been known to drink wine, but the most popular drink at the time was actually another boozy beverage: mead. We have to skip through quite a few centuries, and we have to skip through some really big events in history, all the way to the 8th century BCE, and this century saw the emergence of the Greek city-states and some place called Rome that literally no historian has ever heard of, ever. Eventually, from Macedonia, one Alexander the Great would come and cut a bloody swathe across the world and change it forever with a drink in hand. Hot at his heels came the Romans and their vast empire, and one drink is associated with both of them: wine. Since it was easy to make in these Mediterranean climes, it of course dominated the drink culture of both of these great civilizations. It would be easy to think with all this talk of wine that beer had all but vanished from the world, a forgotten art, but let us not forget that Egypt was still around, as well as the Assyrians, who became the Babylonians, who became the Medes, who became the Persians after them, and beer was still a big part of these cultures. Heck, we've even got evidence of laws about beer and tavern keepers from these empires. These empires, of course, all get a mention in the Bible, so let's do a quick aside. Is beer in the Bible? Well, we know for a fact that wine is found between the pages of the Bible. Noah gets bladdered on it, it's mentioned in Psalms, Proverbs, and the sacraments of Christianity, one of which is communion, which involves wine, and Jesus was often mocked for drinking it and going to too many parties that had it there. In fact, Jesus' first miracle was to make the stuff. Now, the word beer itself is not found because what made beer back then was a bit different to today, but there are references to strong drink. Now, strong drink would have referred to pretty much exactly that. It would have been a beverage with some serious punch, especially given the Romans' habit of flavouring or watering down their wine. Now, stuff like vodka and whiskey weren't around, so this would have been used to refer to really potent wine or some sort of fruit-based drink such as a mead or a barley beer that could have been around at the time. So yes, beer does get a mention in the Bible, but not much of one. Before the Roman Empire, of course, were the Greeks, and when you talk about their drinking habits, you instantly think of alcoholic grape juice, much like the Romans. But we do know that the Greeks had been fond of mead before wine took over in popularity, and they were also experimenting with other beers too, creating early versions of barley wines, and some prominent writers were actually mentioning beer. While the Roman Empire was in full swing, we do get a bit more information about beers that were being drank outside of the empire. For instance, over in Macedonia, the Thracians were enjoying a good beer, possibly as a byproduct of a previous invasion by the Persians. Even further north, Germanic peoples were known to be drinking beer. Of course, the Romans were doing a lot of conquering, and those on the front lines would have been exposed to the local cuisine. Roman legionaries exposed to it would often enjoy a local beer. What the Romans might not have considered is how climate might actually dictate your choice of brew. Further north, wine was taking a back seat, so as they expanded their great empire, they discovered more and more that beer and mead, not wine, was the dominant choice, and as such, it became associated with those uncouth, uncivilized barbarians. Their jaunts into Spain, Gaul, and eventually Britain showed them that all these savages were enjoying beer and mead. Grapes in these regions, of course, weren't very common. Instead, the climate was giving them apples. And what were they doing with them? They invented cider. Indeed, when the Romans finally arrived on British shores, they found us drinking cider and mead. And we weren't really interested in beer, and we weren't really bothered by wine. And it would not be the Romans that would change our tastes on this. This would come later, once the Romans had been and gone. Yes, our love affair with beer was introduced by someone else. Since beer didn't alter all that much at this time, again we have to whiz through quite a few centuries. Civilised folk, of course, were drinking some sort of wine, usually watered down to avoid you getting hammered, and barbarians drank mead, ale or cider, as well as talking funny with that bar language of theirs. All hail the Empire, it's too big to fail, nothing could ever go wrong. Just ignore the sounds of battle over there, it's fine, we're too big to fail. Now don't listen to that nonsense about Huns. Here, have some wine. It's all fine. No, really, it's fine. Goths? What Goths? No, it's fine. Here, have some wine. Why are you looking at me like that? Here, have a drink. Stop asking questions. The Empire's too big to fail.